Okay, welcome everyone to our webinar today. The topic is rights, data and modes of justification in response to COVID-19, reflections from the first year of the pandemic. This webinar today is being hosted by two Arts and Humanities Research Council funded observatories researching UK responses to the pandemic. Firstly, the COVID-19 Review Observatory based at the University of Birmingham, and OMDAC, the Observatory for Monitoring Data-Driven Approaches to COVID, which is an interdisciplinary collaboration between Northumbria University and the Royal United Services Institute. My name is Marion Oswald and I'll be chairing the event today. I'm a Vice Chancellor, Senior Fellow in Law at Northumbria University and an Associate Fellow of RUSI and also the PI of OMDAC. So before I hand over to our speakers, some initial thoughts on this day, this National Day of Reflection. We, of course, remember all coronavirus victims and their families and the toll that the virus has placed on everyone. And our reflections today will be offered in a constructive way in order that lessons can be learned for the future. Data has been at the forefront in a very public way of justification for measures to tackle the pandemic that both protect and curtail rights, and with new forms of data analysis and data combinations being developed at speed. And we might ask ourselves what this means for the future. And I'm sure our two speakers from both of the observatories will be tackling those subjects. Some practicalities. Before I hand over to the speakers. After both speakers have made their presentations, we will open questions up to you, and please do put questions in the chat. The event is being recorded so that it can be posted for viewing later on the observatory's websites. So if you would prefer to post a question anonymously, please do choose that option in the Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker today. Fiona de Londres is Professor of Global Legal Studies at Birmingham Law School and is the Principal Investigator of the COVID-19 Review Observatory, CVRO for short. And the observatory is a UKRI, AHRC funded observatory project that tracks when and how rights are integrated into parliamentary review of COVID-19 responses across the 4 parliaments in the UK. The project seeks to understand whether, when, how and why rights are engaged by parliamentarians in their work of ensuring accountability and scrutiny of pandemic responses, and also to improve rights integrations in this respect. So it's a real pleasure to hand over now to Fiona. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marion. And I'm just going to share my screen here in order to play a PowerPoint presentation. So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. What I want to do over the next 15 minutes or so is to just present some reflections based on the preliminary work we have been doing in the COVID Review Observatory on the ways in which rights have emerged or surfaced, or indeed not surfaced, in Westminster in particular over the past 12 months in respect of COVID. And in doing that, I want to start with 3 observations that I hope are pretty uncontroversial. The first of these observations is that Parliament has the key role in determining rights and ensuring rights protection within the constitutional structure of the United Kingdom. that is reinforced by the Human Rights Act, as well as the general constitutional structure of the UK, so that we would expect that questions of rights compliance, rights adequacy and rights permissibility should arise in parliamentary business where they are, clearly germane to a particular set of policy decisions or legislative decisions. The second, I hope, uncontroversial point to start with, and which Marion has already alluded to, is that this pandemic, as with other pandemic type events, implicates rights in complex ways. On the one hand, it implicates and engages the state's positive obligations under human rights law, including to protect people from loss of life and to take other steps to protect public health, which is ordinarily a permitted exception or limitation where rights are qualified. But it also implicates the, let's say, negative obligations of the state. So what the state can do in order to give effect to that positive obligation is, of course, bounded by the provisions of human rights law. And the important thing about the ways in which the pandemic implicates rights is to say that it is not at all straightforward. And it is, in fact, something that requires discussion, deliberation, and contestation, which in the UK we would hope and expect would take place in the parliamentary setting. And the third point to note, which is a general point, is that rights compliance and rights engagement is part of what underpins the perceived legitimacy of the state and social acceptability of state actions. Acceptability is key to compliance, particularly in respect of guidance or voluntary measures that would help to address mass events such as the pandemic. So there is a connection here with the constitutional structure of the UK, with the nature of the rights implications of the pandemic, and of course, with the idea of an effective public health response in the first place. And so exactly a year on from the first debate on the coronavirus bill, which is where I start, I think it's worth just mentioning or reflecting on how little rights figured in the debates on the coronavirus bill, which became the Coronavirus Act. Participants in this seminar will likely know that that piece of law progressed through a pretty quick process. And there are 4 primary stages where there was discussion, which are mapped out here. Second reading in the Commons Committee stage, and the second and third reading in the Lords. And just as mentioned, so the number of times these rights, these words were mentioned in those debates are identified here on this chart. The blue line is rights, but we've also been counting for the words freedoms and liberties, which act as synonyms for rights. And you can see there that over the course of a couple of days of debate, the most that rights was mentioned in a single sitting was 33 times. So it's not something that was very prominent. And when we drill down into those figures a little bit more and translate the number of times the words were mentioned to the number of times that there was a discussion about rights, freedoms, or liberties. So you might mention the word rights 4 times in a paragraph that is one discussion, let's say. It becomes an even smaller number of discussions. So that in fact, in terms of rights per se, there are only 14 points in the second reading in the Commons, which was the primary debate, where questions or challenges or concerns were constructed as being concerns emanating from rights. And if you expand that to freedom or freedoms, liberty or liberties, it goes up to 24, but quite a few of those were broad discussions about how the bill restricted liberty or restricted freedom. And so in fact, we see that in respect of this incredibly significant piece of law that was being introduced very quickly, rights, freedoms, and liberties as substantive benchmarks for scrutiny and deliberation were not particularly prominent. where those rights, liberties, and freedoms did arise, it was usually around a very small number of issues. And you see from this table that the primary issue in respect of which the parliamentary debates engaged with rights was around care and people with entitlements under the Care Act that were different to and are arguably greater than entitlements under the ECHR. And concerns were raised on these numerous occasions, 18 occasions in total across the debate on the Coronavirus Act about care. But other than that, you just have sprinkles of discussion. The burial rights are worth, or burial is worth just dwelling on for a moment. At most stages, express concerns were raised about the rights of people of particular religious denominations to have religiously appropriate burial arrangements facilitated under the law. So that explains that. In contrast to how little rights talk there was, it's interesting to note what we did talk about in Parliament in respect of the coronavirus bill. And that was primarily the nature of the situation in which the state found itself. So the blue line here reflects the number of times that emergency was mentioned, that crisis was mentioned, or that parliamentarians spoke about the situation in which we found ourselves a year ago as being unprecedented. The orange line, in contrast, is how many times the words proportionality or proportionate arose in those same dates, so those same debates, with proportionality and proportionate arising as modes of justification or talking about rights, given proportionality's role as a way of reasoning in rights talk. So you see there, as we might have expected, that the dominant mode of justification, the dominant frame within which this bill was being passed, was an emergency framework or an urgency framework. And in that respect, perhaps it is not terribly surprising, one might say, that at that particular point in time, there was relatively limited express engagement with rights, with substantive rights issues. That is something that we see across emergency lawmaking. It's worth noting that there were 3 amendments proposed to the bill that were expressly framed as having as their intention the better protection of rights under the framework of the bill. And all 3 of these amendments that I've just highlighted here, 1 at committee stage in the Commons and 2 in the House of Lords, were amendments that were proposed in a way that recognized the exigencies of the situation. So the proposers were saying, we understand that we need to legislate with urgency at this time, but we also need to make sure that as we look to the future, we have processes through which we can actually understand and track the effect of this law on rights and equality. So there was 1 proposal in the Commons and 1 in the Lords, both from the Liberal, 1 from Labour and 1 from the Liberal Democrats, which were proposing a mode of reviewing and monitoring particular parts of the bill with the intention that a body like the Equality or Human Rights Commission would be asked to do that, and they were both rejected. The third proposed amendment that I have just highlighted there was an amendment to note that all powers must be exercised in accordance with the Human Rights Act and the Equality Act. The government rejected that, saying that as those acts were still in place, this amendment was unnecessary. So at that point in time, we have, some foresight around the fact that we might want to have information about rights impacts in the future, but a general concession to urgency and emergency and a lack of rights talk. And so what happened then over the course of the next year? In other words, did we, over the course of the year that followed the passage of the Coronavirus Act, actually double back when things were less urgent, the situation was less exigent, and engage with rights in an effective way? Well, the answer to that is that we didn't. People who are here might know that one of the concessions that the government made in the Coronavirus Act was to provide for a vote every 6 months. Indeed, a vote will come up later this week for the 12-month vote on whether or not the temporary provisions within the Act should expire. This was presented by government as a significant concession and indeed as a safeguard to ensure that rights would be protected. Importantly, the mode of that vote is for the House of Commons to be asked either to have the entirety of the temporary provisions in the Coronavirus Act renewed or to negate them. So they cannot just have some continue and some not continue, which is very problematic. But the first time there was a renewal debate, which was last September, the debate lasted longer than renewal debates have lasted in some other contexts, so just over an hour and a half. And in the context of that debate, there were 7 express discussions of human rights. Again, 2 of those related to care, with 1 response from the Secretary of State, 2 related to people with disabilities, 1 to workers' rights, and 1 to the power to detain infectious persons, which is the only new or fresh human rights issue raised here compared to the coronavirus bill debates themselves. But again, the response by the Secretary of State and the response by the government was simply to continue to say that the act was proportionate and necessary, and there was no, substantive engagement with whether or not human rights, proportionality, adequacy, and permissibility tests were met within the act itself. And I think we can expect very similar types of debates this week because the preparatory materials and the 2 monthly reports prepared by the government don't actually engage in a kind of substantive rights analysis. There are, of course, other parts of everyday parliamentary business where we might expect to see human rights engaged in discussions of COVID-19. And it's important to acknowledge that, in fact, Parliament has been very involved in scrutiny processes around the pandemic. So over the first year, we've had 60 parliamentary committee inquiries relating to COVID-19, but only 2 of those inquiries actually raise human rights issues in their terms of reference. Both of those are by the Joint Committee on Human Rights. And even in areas or inquiries where the human rights issues are entirely manifest, for example, inquiries into the procurement of personal protective equipment, raising questions around the right to life and the state's positive obligations there, or inquiries into the provision of free school meals, raising questions about the right to food. Those inquiries were not framed in a way that engaged with human rights, and submissions made to those inquiries that sought to frame them as rights related and to draw out the rights related issues within their inquiries were not engaged with in the reports. So committees other than the Joint Committee on Human Rights are not really engaging with rights as a benchmark or as a mode of challenging and trying to assess the effectiveness of the government's response. I should mention here that the Women and Equalities Committee have engaged with COVID, and an equalities analysis, one might argue, should be included here as a rights-related analysis. But even if we include that, the omission of rights in general from committee proceedings is very significant. And the last thing that I'll mention in terms of an example of everyday parliamentary business is Prime Minister's questions. Now, of course, it is important to begin any analysis of Prime Minister's questions by acknowledging that PMQs are a form of spectacular accountability that doesn't have any real substantive purchase as a constitutional matter. But nevertheless, they are an important ritual of scrutiny and accountability that happen on a weekly basis. And over the course of the last year, there have been over 1,000 Prime Minister's questions asked, of which more than half have related expressly to COVID. And our analysis suggests that at least 400 of those raised clear human rights questions or issues But in fact, human rights are not mentioned at all in any of those questions, except for 3 questions. One, which was posed by Jeremy Corbyn when he was leader of the opposition, one posed by Ed Davey, and one other posed by Wilson, where she framed her question in terms of liberties. So out of over 1,000 Prime Minister's questions, only 3 of them on COVID related to rights. So where does this all leave us at the end of the first year of the pandemic? Well, the first thing that I think is very obvious is that in Parliament, at least, there is very little rights talk when it comes to COVID. And we might speculate about or discuss the reasons for that. Part of it might be, of course, that there has been a toxification of rights talk in certain quarters, so that there is an assumption that human rights talk can only be deployed here in order to challenge measures that restrict our liberties or freedoms, and not in fact be a mode of questioning adequacy of the government's response. So that's one, potential reason. Another is potentially the hostility to rights in the current political climate, but neither of those 2 potential explanations do anything to undermine the principle that Parliament is a key forum for rights protection and scrutiny in the UK system. As we've already said, of the little rights talk that there is, it is dominated by a small number of issues. And it's worth noting, I think, that those issues are primarily in what we would call the field of civil and political rights. There is remarkably little discussion of the right to health, the right to food, the right to adequate housing, and so on. So social and economic rights, which are clearly relevant to the current situation, are not generally being engaged with. There's also an insufficient engagement with positive obligations imposed by human rights law in terms of the pandemic response. And we should say that that is not inevitable. Just last week in the Scottish Parliament, when the Scottish Coronavirus Act was being extended, the government there asserted its obligations, its positive obligations under human rights law to protect the rights of people in its jurisdiction, including the right to health. As noted, the committees do not seem to appreciate the rights-related implications of their remits and to leave everything to the Joint Committee on Human Rights. So as we come to the 12-month renewal debate and the end of the first year the first legal year of this pandemic, let's say, there is clearly a need for rights to be more effectively integrated in parliamentary business as a mode of justification, permissibility, and adequacy of the government's response to the pandemic. It may also be necessary to put in place some practical changes in Parliament in order to ensure effective engagement with rights. And I would just note that the NGO Liberty has proposed the establishment of a COVID-19 select committee, which I think would be very useful in terms of reorganizing parliamentary engagement here. And it would, of course, be particularly useful to see rights once again becoming part of opposition engagement through PMQs and other opportunities in their scrutiny of the government's response to the pandemic. So I leave it there for now and look forward to our discussion later.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for a really illuminating analysis there. And I can see questions are already coming in for later. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Rachel Alsop, who is a research associate based at Northumbria University within the OMDAC project, which, as I mentioned before, is another AHRC funded project looking at the data-driven approaches to COVID-19 and the legal, ethical, policy and operational challenges. Rachel has research interests in law and technology, and particular around new data-driven technologies and autonomous systems. She has an industry background, having worked as the legal and compliance executive for a gambling software development company before entering academia. So over to you, Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Great. Thank you very much for that introduction, Marion, and thank you everyone for attending today on this National Day of Reflection, marking the anniversary of the first coronavirus lockdown. So today, by way of introduction, I'm going to start by just really be sharing with you some of ONDAC's initial findings and reflections using a series of quotes mainly obtained during the first part of the ONDAC project. So this first part was a landscape mapping assessment of the various data-driven responses to COVID-19, which have been observed over the last 12 months. And in this assessment, we conducted interviews with a wide variety of key stakeholders from across lots of different sectors, data experts, law enforcement, government, regulators, the medical profession, legal profession, and an interdisciplinary range of academics as well. And in doing so, we've been able to capture sort of really rich insights into not only the types of data-driven responses to the pandemic, but also what the key concerns and risks have been perceived to be by these sort of central stakeholders, really using that data to take our direction from these insights in terms of what we next want to explore as part of the project. So the first main finding that I'd like to really share with you all is the meaning of data-driven. So we left this term deliberately open to allow our interviewees to interpret the terminology. And what we found was actually that it was being really widely interpreted. People mentioned everything is data-driven or data cuts across everything. And while there was some focus on perhaps the more advanced novel uses of data or technology, for example, machine learning or AI and using big data sets, the majority of stakeholders actually focused more fundamentally on the use of data itself and the traditional methods for analysing the data, such as good old-fashioned statistics, to really assist with the pandemic-related decision-making. And one participant helpfully visualized this as a spectrum of data-driven responses using an analogy of a Russian doll. So I'll just read the quote in a bit more detail. We're in a sort of Russian doll moment where everything is data-driven, everything from the tiers that people are put into through to vaccines and who gets a vaccine. There are layers and layers, and I would define data-driven response as on a spectrum. There are data-driven policy responses that very much have a human in the loop, all the way through to decisions that are entirely made on available data and are automated. It's how much you want to focus on the automation at one end or the data quality. And this focus fundamentally on the data itself was also reflected in some of the main concerns which were raised with regard to employing a data-driven approach to responding to the pandemic. Arguably, obviously, as Marion mentioned, the government's been very clear in stating that the pandemic response is being driven by the data and driven by science. And this was obviously illustrated in the regular number 10 briefings, where the latest coronavirus statistics were presented by means of graphs and charts. And then we also had the assertion that unlocking the country would be driven by data, not dates. But our stakeholders were really keen to point out to us that it's not quite as simple as just following the data. There are a number of key limitations which need to really be taken into account and transparently communicated to the public. So there's three limitations really that I would like to touch on today and share with you. The first one is about data quality. So it was pointed out that a lot of the data that's being relied on to reach these decisions is actually quite poor in quality in terms of there's errors, gaps and omissions. It might be biased in ways or out of date. Quite often there was formatting and definitional issues which affected interoperability when data sets were being shared. And also by its very nature, the real lack of qualitative insight or context that the data allowed. So I'm just going to again read a few quotes with you. Foundational infrastructure for NHS data collection is patchy and reliant on busy professionals inputting data. There's a huge amount of missing data which affects outcomes. Another participant said, the downside is related to the risk of not knowing what we're missing. There's huge issues with data quality, accuracy and completeness. One striking example of this comes from a study linking primary care trust data with hospital data on a huge scale. An analysis of ethnicity found that large amounts of ethnicity information was missing. Are we effectively flagging what we do not know and highlighting the huge gaps in the data? Are we counting what counts? Qualitative insights not being incorporated into these models. There are some real blind spots where we are not counting what counts. We have an illusion that the data is providing an answer, but there are qualitative aspects which may be missing. So as that stakeholder mentioned, even where the data is correct, there are aspects which actually just can't be captured in quantitative data. And as the quote on the slide mentions, the importance of contextual interpretation, often requiring local knowledge and expertise, becomes key in that regard. So the presence of gaps or immeasurable aspects of data leads me on to the second issue which was identified, which is by necessity the presence of assumptions. So as we've discussed, a lot of the data-driven pandemic response involved traditional statistical methods of analysis and modelling to inform the decision-making, which inevitably this involves the use and incorporation of particular assumptions. Assumptions are crucial and all models have assumptions baked into them. One stakeholder mentioned that the number 10 briefings represent the largest and most prolonged example of regular presentation of data sources to the public. It has been effective in focusing on rise and falls in number of case numbers. What has been less transparent, however, are the models being used and the assumptions going into those models. When looked at trials of contact tracing apps, there were models about how people would respond, but no information about what assumptions were built in about how those people would respond. So the use of assumptions is, of course, part of the process, and it's important that those assumptions and the related uncertainties that the assumptions are in place for are actually made transparent to aid understanding and enable proper scrutiny. So one participant noted there's perhaps been a lack of interdisciplinarity, but with any model, they have to make assumptions. All models are wrong, but some are useful. And relatedly, another participant said, there's an attitude that you throw the data over the wall and the mathematician throws back the answer and that answer becomes the science. It's very easy to confuse the output from your statistical analysis as truth. And that, I think, was really interesting and links nicely onto the third limitation that I wanted to raise and highlight. And this limitation centers around the issue that it's not as simple as saying that it's the data informing decisions. There's also value judgments right through the data life cycle, from what to count and how to count it through to the decision that is being based on the data. One really illuminative quote in that regard, I'll just read out now. So data-driven implies that we're looking at people's data and making decisions about what to do next based on that data. However, the actual situation is far more complex. Those decisions are in turn informed by value judgments and which data are actually being used and whose data is actually being evaluated. We then need to make value judgments about what the data implies and what we are going to do with it. If we understand the facts are theory-laden and value-laden, then any of the data to inform the decisions implies value. And another person mentioned, what I'm really concerned about is the idea that data is true and that it's always correct and that a data-driven decision is somehow neutral. I can imagine that there will be a whole load of things that become automated or happen in a less democratic or transparent way because they are perceived to be based on data. And as alluded to on the title, on the title of the slide, one of our interviewees said the main approach that's being operated by the government is overseen by SAGE, the CMO, and the government's chief scientist, called it white coats that the government hides behind for its tough decision making. But they highlighted that still this leaves people with questions about whether it is all the whether this is all the data tells us, or is it just supporting the approach that the government wants to push. I want to see data-informed policy showing the division between the information, additional thinking, and here's what we've decided to do. So for a lot of our stakeholders, you know, in saying led by the science, it suggests that science can give you the perfect knowledge and tell you what to do, when actually it's a far more complicated process and situation than it is perhaps being led to appear as. And that's why for the majority of our stakeholders that we spoke to, certainly in the first landscape mapping assessment, transparency was really highlighted as a key issue that needs to be a central part of this process. So our stakeholders felt that there needed to be much more transparency. Here, one participant said, "Nothing that I've ever been party to in my career in intelligence has actually affected people's movements and association, except if you're a terrorist. But at the policy level, if you're making choices based on data that affect people's freedom of movement and life in general, you really need to go to the max to ensure the independence and quality of the data. And you also need to assert on a wider national interest basis what the policy responses are." So transparency, according to one interviewee, should be about making the best possible use of available information from a wide variety of sources and being transparent about limitations, what the assumptions are about making use of the data, and that the assumptions that are filling the gaps. As the quote on this slide illustrates, and this was mentioned in the recent report from the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, transparency really is central to the issue of public trust. The committee said there's a moral imperative on the government to clearly justify each of these decisions. Part of that is making the data that is driving the response and its interpretation available so people can understand why they're being asked to make such sacrifices. The government must build trust and cooperation by being open and transparent about the data. Data transparency is not just a moral issue, it's integral to the success of the response to this pandemic. And transparency builds trust, and trust aids compliance with the rules. So yeah, that's just sort of an initial insight and reflection on one of the key areas that came out, one of the many areas that came out of our initial landscape assessment interviews. And we're now in the process actually of undertaking some more focused in-depth interviews on 3 specific areas of interest that came out from the initial discussions. So these are, the first one is data-driven decision-making from pandemic public policy, and you'll hopefully be able to see that that comes through very strongly from what I've touched on today about really the importance of the underlying data as being fundamental to the pandemic response. The second area that we're looking at is the new data-driven technologies for public health, things like contact tracing app and potentially vaccine passports. And the third area is data-driven policing and public safety in the pandemic. What these reports will provide a snapshot, so we're going to do a snapshot report for each of those 3 areas, and they'll provide really, as it says, a snapshot into the way these responses have been applied during the pandemic, as well as the key risks and benefits and legal implications that have been observed. We're due to publish those in May time, so do look out for those coming out. But what I would like to highlight actually, and it's come out really strongly in speaking to these key stakeholders across all of the interviews done so far, those who are involved in the various data-driven approaches, they're actually really keen to share their experiences and speak with us and tell us about the things that they've learned along the way, the things that have worked well, things that maybe haven't worked so well, and challenges that they've encountered. And this, I think, highlights the importance of these 2 observatory research projects, actually, which is to make sure that all of this learning is actually being captured and put to good use for the future and doesn't get lost, really. So yeah, details of our website I've included there on the slide, and we have some blog articles and reflection pieces on there which are available to read. We also put some details of events that have been hosted or that we're involved in, and you can sign up to our newsletter on the website as well to keep up to date with anything that we're involved in or anything that we're published. Twitter details are also there. So finally, yes, thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Rachel. That was great, and good plug at the end there as well. So I can see that we have some questions come in. I'm just going to use Chair's prerogative before I move on to the questions that have been posted, just to ask you, both of you, a linked question really that I think goes to both of your presentations around whether we perhaps due to the focus, the big focus that has been on data, whether we are potentially seeing a bit of a rights recession at the moment, as I think Fiona's presentation referred to. So maybe I could go to Fiona first for thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Marion, and Rachel for that fantastic presentation. In terms of whether we're experiencing a rights recession, I think the answer is a rather unsatisfactorily fudgy one, because certainly on one hand, we have across politics, certainly in Westminster, although not necessarily in the other parliaments of the United Kingdom, a significant discursive recession in terms of rights. So we don't see rights being put at the forefront of core discussions, deliberations and debates, even when there are very clear human rights related issues. So for example, all of the political debate about whether, and if so when and how, there would be an inquiry into the handling of the pandemic and lives lost over the course of the pandemic is being primarily pursued divorced from human rights discussion, even though there is a very clear human rights connection, which is the obligation to investigate under Article 2 of the ECHR, positive obligations relating to the right to life. So certainly there's a discursive recession, or I shouldn't say certainly, but it does seem that way. And I think that is really significant. But it is also, I think, interesting that discursive recessions and experienced recessions in rights enjoyment, let's say, are not necessarily aligned. So, of course, over the past year, we have seen restrictions to our everyday lives that have implications for rights. But we have also seen the state take positive steps that better protect rights than we would have seen them do in the past. So, for example, steps around the provision of material goods, of money, of food, of care, of medicines, steps around the provision of accommodation to people who are described as rough sleepers. There have been some things that in fact have had positive rights effects, although they're very much presented as being temporary, and they are not generally, as I said, presented or discussed from a human rights perspective. So I think it's a very interesting and very sort of sticky or fudgy area to try to get to the heart of. The presentation of decisions, Rachel's presentation is fantastic here. The presentation of these decisions as being based on data not only hides, or presents as neutral something that is not neutral, but also substitutes rights-related justification with a data-driven justification in a way that has been taken to imply or suggest that if something is driven by data, it must be rights compliant or it must be sufficient. Not only does that, of course, fail to appreciate the complexities of data and the politics of data that Rachel was drawing out there, but it also conflates two sets of questions and modes of decision making that are not the same. And that is, I think, more broadly something that we should be watching out for and be concerned about, and something that connects the kinds of intellectual projects that both of our teams are engaged in.
Thanks. Rachel, do you have further thoughts on that the data side of things?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to add really was actually on a specific right of the right to privacy. So you could say that potentially there's a been a privacy recession in that the amount that data and personal data is being shared and used in a much more integral way. But on the flip side of that, it depends how you're defining privacy as well. So is privacy about keeping everything secret and not sharing that data, or is it about it being shared under mature and really good governance frameworks and being looked after properly? So some of the interesting things that have came out of a couple of the interviews is that actually there was real barriers in place, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic. Local government finding it really difficult to get a hold of data that they needed to inform their pandemic response, which at the local level was actually really important. Some of the stakeholders that we spoke to couldn't even get a hold of the data protection officers at the central level to speak to them, and really just couldn't get access to data on a non-aggregated basis to be able to identify people who are at risk, for example, and help in the pandemic response. Relatedly, on the test and trace contact tracing app, one stakeholder that we spoke to mentioned that actually that was really privacy advocates really heavily dominated the conversation at the beginning of the design of that, which meant that obviously it went to a decentralized model rather than a centralized model. But actually, the person that we spoke to mentioned that this could have actually had negative implications as well on how effective the app was actually able to be, the value that could come out of it. So it can be viewed on both regards, I think, and it's not a yes or no answer.
As Fiona said, a very sticky situation. So I'm going to move to the questions now in our Q&A. The first one from Tom, I think perhaps I'll address to Fiona. Do you consider the right to participate in scientific advancement and share its benefits? Article 27(2).
Yeah, thanks, Tom, for that question. It would be one of the things that we're looking for when we're analysing the relevant debates, so whether or not there is discussion of it or it's engaged. In the analysis we've done so far, so we started at the end of November, we haven't gone through all of the debates that preceded that moment, but in the analysis we've done so far, it hasn't arisen in Westminster, and I find that very interesting. This is not the only way that you could engage that right, of course, but there is a clear implication for the vaccine rollout, distribution of vaccine, and there hasn't been much rights framing around questions of the distribution of vaccine. That may be because in the UK we haven't experienced very significant shortages. So there hasn't been massive decision making around prioritization in a context where you knew that deprioritized cadres would be waiting a very long time. But I think if supply issues arise, certainly we would be looking out for rights-related construction of the debates, but thus far, very little.
Thank you. And I think we've got two related questions from anonymous attendees. The first one is mentioning Rachel's comment around potential poor data, but pointing out that the outset there was an insistence that any tech-based response respect data protection, with some even insisting that big tech be restricted from any role other than anonymous, decentralized contact tracing. Should we critically examine the role of data protection in this respect, which links back to Rachel's earlier comments, and also a second question around should we define new data-related rights in light of the COVID-19 data-driven responses? Perhaps I could go to Rachel first on that.
Yeah, really good questions. I think the one interesting thing that's coming out of some of the interviews is about possibly data-related rights. One local authority doing some, I mean, there's loads of really interesting work there, and I think a lot of lessons learned will come out of just talking to people that we're doing. But one particular local authority are actually speaking with people in the community, and they've formed a group who are going to put together what they've called a data charter, which is what they're expecting to be done with their data and how they're expecting their data to be used, and the ethical principles that they want to be seen and incorporated, and that local authority is going to make that part of their framework, their information governance framework, which I think is really interesting. But really think that it comes back to transparency and seeing what the public actually expect to be done with their data, and what they want to be, how they want, what they want it to be. So a lot of the local authorities that we've spoken to, they said that they're using internal data sets combined in ways that hasn't been done before, but people just assumed that they were already, and when they spoke to people, were like, well, we thought that you would have already known that information, but obviously it's all in different siloed departments within the internal organisation. So it's just really interesting that's coming out with, and I think the further discussions that we're doing with the interviews is only going to inform that even more.
Thanks. And Fiona, does that relate to the positive rights that you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, potentially. Certainly the connection of different databases has implications in terms of rights, not only privacy rights, but just to give one example, Rachel was talking about, lack of connectedness that one might not expect. To just flag the Public Accounts Committee report on the free school meal voucher scheme, where they noted, in a way that I think many people found shocking, that the Department of Education could not connect to the database of children whose families were on universal credit. So there were children whose families were on universal credit who were not on the free school meals register and were not provided with meals. And this was simply not by the Public Accounts Committee, but by the department accepted as a kind of technical barrier, but of course it had significant implications for the rights of those children to food, which is the fundamental right protected under the Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights.
Thank you. And an anonymous question here about the values underpinning data, which I think relates to both of your talks. How can we diversify the kinds of people and experiences that are inputting into the design of data-driven technology, and I suppose also to the pandemic responses more generally? Perhaps Fiona, come to you first on that.
Yes, and I think this connects also to Professor Shankar's question as well in the Q&A, Kalpana Shankar's question. And I think it's key, diversification or pluralization of evidence bases is absolutely fundamental if we are to really understand the impacts of policy decisions that are being made, both their adequacies and their inadequacies. And from a human rights perspective, there is an international obligation to keep under review and, where necessary, to reform responses that are insufficient to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights of people in your jurisdiction. In terms of the processes that we would have been looking at in the observatory that generate what we might call data about lived experience, probably the closest that parliaments do is to do calls for evidence to inquiries by committees. And I think it's just worth noting two things there. The first is that in Westminster, the terms of reference thus far in COVID-related committees have tended, where they exist, to be very technical and also often to have a very short window. The Joint Committee on Human Rights is a bit of an exception, but many of them had very, very short windows to submit. And I just want to point as a counter example to processes by the Equality and Human Rights Committee in the Scottish Parliament, where they have this website, Have Your Say, and it's really easy to just go in and write something. The questions are framed in ways that are quite accessible and anybody can put their experience in it. And in fact, it generates a really significant body of empirical ethnographic data that's significant to understand the effects of policies and thus to understand their rights adequacy or inadequacy. And I think in a very short window recently, they had over 800 responses from members of the general public. There's no equivalent positive effort of that kind in Westminster.
Thank you. That's really interesting and quite concerning. And just to go to Professor Shankar's question, perhaps to Rachel as well, the question is how can lived experiences be captured within data? I think that's something that's come up in the discussions with stakeholders, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's a really difficult one, and it's a great question. I had a really interesting discussion last week with one local authority who they recognise the limitations of quantitative data. So they're doing a lot of collection of data and research, but also they have a team or research area focused on qualitative research as well, and collection of qualitative research data about COVID and more generally. And they highlighted the importance of those two teams working together and combining the findings in. So one example, which was really interesting, was around finding, so the quantitative data had identified perhaps that members of minority communities, a particular minority community, weren't engaging with the testing aspect. They weren't coming and getting tested as much as perhaps was hoped, but weren't really able to identify why. So then the qualitative research that followed up on that, it found that people from this particular community were concerned that the test would be, the women in particular were concerned that the test would be administered by males, and so that was putting these particular women off going and getting tested. So then they were able to actually use that insight, which wouldn't have ever been obtained from the data and from the quantitative data, to action a response and address that concern for that community. So I think it just, it highlights that you can be informed by the quantitative data, but actually it's not that you can't get that rich full picture from it, and it's the context it's needed as well, and that applies to the lived experiences as well.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more set of questions from Adam. So they're split into two here. For Fiona, the thing that's worried me is the judiciary's lack of desire to interrogate the COVID regulations through the lens of proportionality. Do you think this is linked with the Parliament's lack of discussion?
I think that's a really interesting question, Adam. I mean, there are clearly at least two significant challenges that arise when we think about litigation as a mode of trying to get to grips with the pandemic response and to force a better response, whether that's more state action or less in any particular context. And the first of these is timing, and that is that, as we saw in a number of cases, by the time something comes to court, actually it's moot because regulations are changing so quickly. But the second relates directly, I think, to this question of, let's say, judicial deference and how it will play out in this context. One might argue that there are very good institutional reasons for courts to be reluctant to be overly rigorous in their scrutiny, or to put this, I shouldn't put it like that. I should say that there are good institutional reasons for courts to exercise deference, right, in a context like this, which is scientifically and medically complex, which is, economically complex, and all the rest of it. But deference is premised on the notion of effective parliamentary engagement with the issues. And if we have a parliament that is not engaging with rights, then my question would be, to what extent the principles that underpin deference, in particular the notion that Parliament has reached a judgment on the proportionality or necessity or adequacy of this particular impugned measure, can reasonably inform judicial decision making here. So, if there is going to be deference towards the other organs of the state, then the other organs of the state have to do their part. And that means in part that they have to engage rigorously, effectively, consistently, and robustly with the demands made of the state by the human rights infrastructure.
Thanks, Fiona. And for Rachel, do you worry that the use of data and the hiding behind white coats leads us towards technocracy and hollows out politics, thereby making public buy-in difficult, at least for the short term?
Good question. I think that one of the big issues about it is the complexities and being, you know, the government's being informed by, there's a number of different opinions. Also, it's the models don't give the right or wrong answer, but it's very complicated, and it's almost a comms issue. I think almost there's the data literacy or lack of data literacy in the public is an issue, but there's ways that it can be communicated in a more simple way but open way, identifying the uncertainties and showing the limitations. Showing that it's, yeah, I don't have a yes or no answer on that. I think it's just it's a complicated, it's complicated anyway.
Thanks, Rachel. Yes, it was a tricky question to end with, so apologies for that. Can blame Adam.
I will.
I think we're just about out of time now, and thank you for everyone for their great questions, and apologies if I didn't manage to get to everyone's question, but I think the ones that we have managed to engage with have shown the breadth of interest and also the breadth of issues that there still is to discuss. So I hope we can continue this conversation as the projects move forward, and you know, please do get in touch with us if you'd like to engage further or more directly. Just remains for me to thank Fiona and Rachel for their amazing presentations and for being put on the spot in the Q&A, and also a big thanks to Anne Evans, Pablo Grez from Birmingham University, and Hugh Oberlander from RUSI for helping us organise this event and being the sort of the people that have kept it all going. So really big thanks to them. And I'm sure we would hope to see you all again at another event soon. Thank you very much.